make another wake-up call and give you a lot of food for thought. We will talk about the energy transition, and we don't talk about solar panels or windmills and all the discussions we also have in Switzerland. We will talk about the influence of the energy transition on geopolitics, war, and peace. And therefore, I would like to introduce to you Olivia Lazard. She's an outstanding expert in peace building at field and policy. She has worked for NGOs, the United Nations, European Union, and donor countries in the Middle East, in Africa, Asia, Latin America. Her research focuses on understanding how globalization and international economic systems can influence patterns of violence and vulnerability and create new forms of conflict situations. Give her a warm applause. Olivia Lazard.
I suppose I'm both privileged and slightly unlucky to come after Sir Behrens. He obviously de-weeded a lot of the field that I'm going to talk about. And I'm usually unaccustomed to having a person before me who does the shock and awe job. So I'm kind of wondering where I'm picking you up at this stage. I'm very thankful for the fact that you guys have come in between us so that you can represent essentially the good news before I take you back again, way, way down, and then pick you back up. That's at least my wish and my hope for tonight. If you look at the slide over there, you're going to read about the last industrial revolution. You may wonder what it has to do with climate change. Well, that's because in order to talk about climate change and about the geopolitical consequences and dynamics around climate change, we need to take a longer view. I first need to give you a sense of what's going on around the planet, and then how we are intending to respond to the changes in and on the planet in Europe and elsewhere. And this is why I'm going to talk about climate policy within the context of the fourth industrial revolution. First, let me tell you what happened on the 17th of November, 2023. For the very first time in recorded human history, we passed the 2-degree threshold. It probably didn't make so much of the news, because that's a very damning news, but this is a very important moment for you to remember. It is momentary. It probably comes as a result of what we call the El Niño phenomenon, which we're currently right in the middle of and which will probably peak by next summer. But the fact that we passed the 2-degree threshold compared to pre-industrial levels tells us about a trajectory of complex human civilizations on the planet. It is quite problematic that we're already hitting that type of ceiling, because scientists tell us that if we pass permanently the 1.5 threshold, or if we pass it in moments of our history, we will set off tipping points. Tipping points are essentially different interdependencies that exist between various ecosystems around the world, starting with the poles. And if the poles, for example, start diminishing in their ice surface, the planet will be unable to absorb the energy intensity that we're releasing as a result of industrial activity. If the poles go, it is very likely that we will have a collapse, or at least a slowing down, of the AMOC, an ocean circulation system that allows temperature systems across the northern hemisphere to stabilize. We are already seeing different tipping points in action. If you read the news about the drought in the Amazon, you will notice probably that we are talking about certain thresholds that are currently being passed. It tells you already one thing: a rise in temperature is not just a linear thing. It is something that has an impact on how nature reacts and how it helps to stabilize complex human civilizations. It gives us a space, collectively, to interact within. And the last piece of bad news from a biophysical perspective is that 6 out of 9 planetary boundaries are already a cross-threshold. We don't just have a climate change problem, we have a biodiversity problem, we have a pollution problem, we have a water problem and hydrological cycling problem. All of these different issues interact with one another. When they are stable, they provide what we call a carrying capacity of the planet to sustain and support complex human civilizations. They support agriculture, industry, energy systems, economic exchanges. In order to respond to these different problems, we have decided to head right into this famous fourth industrial revolution. What is this fourth industrial revolution? It is the combination of green and digital. It is the combination of so-called clean and dematerialized world and economic exchanges. Interestingly, though, these are based on myths. Because clean and dematerial economic exchanges and energy production actually rely on one single thing: critical raw materials, plenty of them. In order to sustain the same power density that fossil fuel economies have sustained over the last 150 years, we need plenty of different critical raw materials in diversity. We're talking about copper, lithium, cobalt, borate, all of these different things that make solar panels, wind turbines, electric vehicles and batteries, electrical systems, but also smartphones, computers, hard drives, undersea cables, all of these things that are supposed essentially to carry us into the next economic expansion of our human progress story. We are playing a new economic expansion against the background of a planet which is having more and more trouble adapting to the intensity of our energy systems. And the way in which we are about to play out this energy transition, the way in which we're engaging in it, is not fully reckoning with the complexity of decarbonization and digitalization. Before I go any further, I will make a complete disclaimer. This is very important. I am absolutely in favor of decarbonization. This is important to remember because it's not me talking about the complexity of decarbonization is not saying that we need to undermine the transition itself. But we do need to talk about what is happening as a result of our energy transition. This is a picture, a work of art by Dylan Marsh. It represents a copper mine, the amount that is moved in terms of soil in order to extract that much amount of copper. Depending on the ore concentration in different mines around the world, it takes, on average, moving 1 ton of soil in order to extract between 10 and 100 grams of copper. That's because copper is actually like a filament, a dust within the earth. This is the case for a lot of other minerals. They all, and every one of them has their own chemical composition, but what we need to do is to actually rematerialize our economy by mineral extraction in prodigious quantities. An EV, for example, an electric vehicle, takes about 6 times more materials than a conventional car. Again, this is not a question of questioning the energy transition. It's about holding the complexity of it and the material weight of it. And we have more and more numbers coming to account for the energy transition. We don't have any to account for the digital transition and its impact on the world. Because, of course, what we're talking about is not just a mining expansion. We're also talking about an industrial expansion to support the weight of the mineral extraction that we need to provide for. This is the mine Chuquicamata in the northern part of Chile. You don't see the mine on this particular picture. What you see is the infrastructure to support the mine and the processing of copper that comes from a very dry area. And if you look on the upper right-hand corner, you will see flat mountains. These are not natural. They're called tortas. They are the waste from the mine. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of them around the Chuquicamata mine. So we need to wonder, where are we going to get the materials, knowing that in Europe, since we've had already a number of industrial revolutions and we've mined our way through progress, where are we going to get those extra materials that we need in order to get on the other side of the energy and digital transition? Well, you're going to see with those green dots that there are specific concentrations. You can obviously see Australia. You can see a few dots in the United States. You can see some dots in Europe, not that many. Mostly, you're going to see some dots in Latin America, in Africa, in Southeast Asia. This map doesn't show deep sea resources, but this is one of the frontiers, essentially, of our industrial revolution. And we know also that there is a very high concentration in areas such as the Central Asian republics and the Western Balkans. This has specific consequences, and I'm going to first talk about the planetary consequences. If you look at the bottom map, you're going to see that the red and orange areas, which are flashing up in Africa, in Latin America, and in Southeast Asia, the very same places where we see the concentration of materials that we need for the energy transition, well, all of these places are particularly climate vulnerable. That means that there is high hydrological stress, knowing that mining and industrial expansion is very water intensive, and that on top of it, they are probably less resilient to the shocks that are coming as a result of climate change. They have less economic, fiscal, and monetary space to weather and completely pocket, essentially, the shocks coming into as a result of climate change. Not just that. There is a problem which is not just confined to each and every country and how they deal with climate change. If you look at this map by Bernardo Strasberg and his team, it highlights the global regeneration priority areas. They're flashing in red and orange. If you see again where they are, Latin America, Central America, Africa, places like Madagascar, India, Southeast Asia, these are the places where essentially they host, these places in the world host the very same critical ecosystems that we need in order to stabilize the climate regime. But not just that, each of these ecosystems are independent, interdependent with one another, and they provide ecological services of massive importance, not just locally, globally, at a planetary level. If we lose the Amazon as a result of mining, agricultural expansion, urbanization, you will see massive drops in rainfall at the border between Mexico and Texas, within the US Midwest, and all the way up to the UK. Because these different ecosystems are in charge of the hydrological cycle of the planet. If we undermine them, if we undercut them, we are not only accelerating certain elements of climate disruptions, but we're also adding pressures to the instability of ecological integrity, we are actively undermining the very systems that support the industrial revolution that we need in order to get on the other side of decarbonization. So, one key thing that I want to convey to you tonight is that when you hear about the green agendas and you hear about the fundamental two legs, tech and nature, nature-based solutions, energy and industrial responses, I want you to keep in mind that particular map. Because what that particular map shows is that there is a fundamental dilemma between the way in which we project our industrial and tech future and the way in which we reconcile with nature. Tech and nature are currently in conflict within the green agendas. This is something that we need to actively backtrack. We need to walk back on this dilemma, because otherwise we will essentially tech our way into the future without being able to maintain the very nature that sustains us as humans and which allows us to function within industrial systems as well as complex human civilizations. You've got the Planetary picture. Let me illustrate it for you in very visual terms before I move on to the international security aspect. What you see on the left-hand side is the northern tip of Madagascar. It is a small area where right underneath those trees there are many, many rare earths. These metals and minerals attract particular investors from China, from Russia, from Germany, from the United States. They compete differently. They have different standards. This particular bay, this particular area of land, stands right over a marine reserve where whales and whale sharks come to nidify every summer. It is a fundamental passage within the Indian Ocean. And this particular marine reserve gives onto another terrestrial reserve where you find endemic species of little, gosh, I forget their name right now. Thank you, lemurs, which are endemic to the area and non-recoverable in other places. If this particular place in the world is extracted from, this ecosystem will collapse. I want to give that to you as a picture because it shows also the things that we do not want to lose as humans. The things that help us to get inspired because they are quite simply beautiful. They are our habitat. They are the reason why we actually have art. We draw inspiration from these very same ecosystems that are likely to be destroyed if we don't pay attention to the direction of our fourth industrial revolution. But there is a problem, and this is what Sir Behrens already talked about. At the very same moment that we have a planetary crisis in the form of climate and biodiversity collapse, we also have a problem of systems rivalry. There is one particular country that has a first mover advantage within the energy and the digital transition, and this is China. If you look at the right-hand side of the slide, you will see that China has a particular concentration of processing capacity, not just for rare earths, in which it is fundamentally endowed, but also for nickel, copper, lithium, cobalt, all the very same materials that you're hearing about every day. This power is very significant. China essentially created a model for the Industrial Revolution, which is created on the back of a vertical integration for mineral supply chains. This integration provides the spine and the backbone of a power transition within the international security system. There is a gravitational pull which is happening as a result of economic demand and economic production towards Asia. And this pull is particularly effective because China has in its hands the capacity to deliver on clean tech, to process all of the minerals that are necessary for the future of the economy and the future of the energy system. And this capacity is not just designed to serve its own market, it is also designed to serve the future of global markets, which also means that it needs to get minerals from outside of its borders. And I come back to this particular map. Behind the green dots, you see a shade of different colors of brown and red. The browner or the redder the country, the more fragile and the more corrupt it is rated to be. If you overlay this with the current Chinese plans for the Belt and Road Initiative that Sir Behrens already talked about, you see a pattern emerging, where essentially a number of different countries in the global south stand today as the arbiters of the energy transition, stand today as the arbiters of the power transition, and their very fragility and vulnerability, not just to climate change, but to political risks, environmental risks, and economic risks, are being used in a systems rivalry which pits China against the US, which pits the EU or Europe against Russia, and which essentially pits different ideologies together. And in my various field travels and missions, what I've observed is essentially that the extraction of minerals is currently positively correlated with the rise of authoritarianism. And it is very likely, considering the use and instrumentalization of fragility, that authoritarianism may be just one step in the direction of new forms of totalitarianism. This is why also what Sir Behrens was talking about is of utmost importance, because the systems rivalry is essentially not just playing in terms of access to materials and economic productions, it is playing over the very future of societal models. And tech, which is obviously playing a huge role in how we interact with one another, how we interact with states, how we interact with other parts of the world, is a particular vulnerability within the systems rivalry. It is not just an enabler of the future, it is a fallibility. So where does that leave us? Well, we have two challenges, right? We have to face the fact that we need to reconcile a fundamental equilibrium between tech and nature, and we have to face a fundamental challenge around this power transition. This starts by moving Europe in particular towards a regenerative and distributive pact. We need to make sure that wherever extraction happens, especially in favor of the energy transition, which needs to be prioritized, we regenerate. This is not just a pact which needs to happen within Europe, it's how a number of different actors within the private sector take with them this model of we will regenerate. We don't just do sustainability, we actively participate in regenerating ecological services. And the first entry point for all of you who are active in the private sector is to look at your impact on water systems. The way in which you use water and the way in which your activity impacts water system. Because if we lose the availability of water as a result of climate change and anthropogenic activities, there will be no fourth industrial revolution. Water and regeneration should not be considered as nice and normative add-ons to the revolution. They are enablers. These are absolute security imperatives. The other thing, and this is something that has just officially started, which I'm spearheading, is we need to make sure that we understand where it is safe to mine and where it is not safe to mine. I am currently working with the University of Exeter to try and map out the ecological sensitivity of certain mining deposits to make sure that those that are too unsafe to move or to touch remain untouched. This will need to escalate within a multilateral negotiation system over the use of energy, because we have unfortunately lost too much time in our fight against climate change, and we cannot afford protectionist industrial policies that are pitting a number of different regions of the world one against the other. And as Europe, the whole of Europe, we're going to have to make sure that we look in the direction of countries of the global south with a particular attention. Because countries in Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, the Western Balkans, and Central Asia are actually the very arbiters of our security starting now. Old alliances with the US and with other actors may stand, but in fact, what will ensure that Europe can withstand the geopolitical, geoeconomic, and geostrategic pressures of the future is how it relates to countries that it has long considered outside of its security purview, and in fact, that it has long considered as a security liability. We're going to have to change a lot of things around how we partner with certain countries, what we partner over, and how we not only help them to adapt to climate change and ecological collapse, but how we also make sure that they adapt with us and that we adapt with them, which will also actually have implications in the future on migration policies, on economic policies that will shape and reshape the form, the content, the societal fabrics of Europe as a whole. And it is very likely that within the next 15 years, we're going to see a lot of geoeconomic shocks coming our way. What that's going to mean is essentially that we're going to have to be particularly clear-sighted about growth modulation. In some circumstances, it is likely that certain sectors will need to grow. Some others may have to shrink their activity in order to reduce their impact on ecological systems, and in order to see how to essentially grow a different type of economic and societal compact at the heart of European societies. I hope I left you with some sense of hope, even though I know that this is a very hard pill to swallow. But I've been impressed by the level of conversations and the type of discussions that the Lucerne dialogue has invited here. Europe faces a difficult and vulnerable future. What will make or break Europe is the ability for all of us to actually stop having blind spots and to shed light on them. And to do that, we need civic actors, public actors, and private sector actors to come together in a platform and in a framework of conversation that will look at risks and opportunities as they stand and as they are, rather than as we wish them to be. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Olivia. I have a question. Very often I hear, Christine, at the end of the day, it's going to be innovation who solves all the problems. What's your response to this?
Well, two, right? Innovation is often, especially now, understood as technological breakthroughs. Technological breakthroughs happen to be very intensive, both from a material perspective, but also from an energy perspective. The reality is that we will not just have to decouple economies from greenhouse gases. We're going to have to reduce fundamentally our energy and our material footprint. So that means shedding that light on technological breakthroughs. The other thing, though, is that there are indeed some technological breakthroughs that have a particular relevance as long as we orient them towards how do we bring back human societies within planetary boundaries. I'll give you a very specific example. We're facing a very high mineral demand. There are many different ways in which to look forward I'm sure that many of you have discussed, for example, the role of the circular economy. The circular economy will have a particular role to play within 15 years. Before that, we actually still need primary extraction. In this primary extraction, we can go towards a mix of brownfield and greenfield projects of the likes that I showed in the first slides, but we can also go towards new technologies such as phytomining, which is essentially using a specific type of plant to draw up metals from polluted landscapes and collecting them in order to actually provide mining materials, metal materials, whilst at the same time depolluting soils. Because we will not be able, again, as I said, to go towards this energy and digital transition on the basis of a fundamentally exhausted carrying capacity. We need to work on depolluting river systems, on making sure that we work with ecological means, not just technological ones, and that we eventually come to this balance essentially between industry and living systems, something that we've never actually had to really face fundamentally as a human species. So innovation does have a place, as long as we change the metrics and we don't just look at markets and potential substitution of certain materials, but also how you orient innovation to recover ecological services, to regenerate them, and to stabilize certain ecosystems that are absolutely vital for the future of humanity.
So it's a real circular economy at the end of the day?
Yes, but we can't get there for another 15 years. What we have to manage is essentially the dilemmas and the contradictions of the next 15 years, knowing that these dilemmas are both thematic, in terms of the contradictions between tech and nature, but they're also indeed relevant to international security. There are different models, for example, of what we consider innovation between certain regions of the world like Europe and Russia, for example, which is also very heavily involved in the mining space, just not with the same types of standards. So we're going to have to use a number of different tools that help us that help to give time, essentially, to create a different economy, whilst creating and inviting a different international security system, which is in any case already on the way. But it's about finding the right standards and the right alliances to make sure that the right innovation comes about.
Mm. I can imagine the people sitting here now thinking, my God, it's so big.
Yes.
It's so big.
It is.
Yeah, what can I do? So sometimes human beings are like, I can't do anything, I don't even start, so, and ignore it. And we have the young generation here, they're going to fix it, with the good innovation. So what would you give us as let's say, advice, in our daily business if we go home afterwards?
Well, first of all, learn to grapple with the complexity, right? When I give this type of talk, the answer is indeed, oh my God,
yeah.
I just want to be out of here and I don't want to listen to her anymore. I was just saying earlier that complexity is not a fatality, it's not a condemnation, it's an invitation. Where we are today shows tremendous progress on the part of the human psyche. That's the 2% that Richard Behrens was talking about earlier. We have gone so far in helping human life, in extending it, in making it more livable, more dignified. We have come so far in creating civilizations that are, God, so complex and so beautiful in their own right. This should not be questioned. However, at a moment when we hear a number of different people, especially within the digital space, saying the next industrial revolution will better enable, will better assist us as humans, and will make us more performant, I say, is this your notion of progress? Is this where you want humanity to go? Where essentially we are assisted in destroying the rest of our environment and in actually producing the fruits of our own demise. So learn to actually hold these contradictions and to see through, forgive my French, the bullshit. And then sit with it. It actually is uncomfortable at the beginning, and then it's actually quite exciting because it helps us to recover a sense of emotional resilience and a sense of emotional depth. And then the next thing is, yes, let's talk about innovation. I meet a lot of young people, indeed, within engineering spaces who are starting to take into account ecology, who are starting to have conversations with the living, and to try and reconcile this notion of, well, as humans, we are both technological and we're natural as a species. These need to come together. This is the challenge where we are today, within the history of humankind.
Last question.
Yes.
Last question. I mean, it's the Lucerne dialogue for a stronger Europe in the title. So what is the role of Europe at the end of the day? Or would you say, honestly, Europe is going to be irrelevant in the whole process?
Do you think that people fight over irrelevant continents? Do you think that wars erupt in places that don't matter? Ukraine, as Sir Richard Behrens was telling us, is the geographical place where the fight is happening, but at the end of the day, what is in question, what is being fought over is an idea which has been long in the making through history, how different countries can come together and create an architecture of peace. Today, what we're facing is actually a much larger challenge of indeed building an architecture of peace, except that it's not going to be just in Europe or for Europe. It is how we can draw from our strengths and our history in Europe and how we use this architecture of peace via new supply chains, new ideas, new partnerships to create a world which is indeed going to be safe and just. This is going to be hard because the reality is essentially that the planet is already in movement and sending a lot of shock waves within our international system. But this is the philosophical, the political, and economic challenge of our time, and it starts here.
Thank you very much. Olivia Lazard, thank you very much. Thank you indeed. Thank you very much, Olivia. Thank you very much.